Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Gönül Tol. I'm the director of MEI's Turkish Studies program and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute's newly launched Frontier Europe initiative. Black Sea region and Black Sea security are some of the areas that we cover at the Frontier Europe. It's an exciting new program. We are one of the few think tanks that explore interactions between the Middle East countries and their Frontier Europe neighbors, which are parts of West Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. And we examine growing energy, trade, security, and political relationships with the goal of developing a greater understanding of the interplay between these strategically important regions. So if you want to know more about the program, please check out our website, and you can follow us at MEI Frontier. And with that, I would like to welcome you all to today's event. We will today discuss the implications of Turkey's decision to purchase Russian S400 missiles and the subsequent US decision to remove Turkey from the F35 program. So how will these developments impact Turkey's defense capabilities? Does growing Turkey-Russia defense cooperation mean Turkey is shifting away from the Western security structure? Will this weaken NATO? And where do we go from here? So to address all these questions, I'm joined by an excellent panel, and let me briefly introduce my panelists. Çağlar Kurç is an adjunct instructor at the Department of International Relations at Bilkent University in Ankara. He was a Fulbright Fellow at the MIT Security Studies program, and after that he was a visiting postdoctoral scholar at the Columbia University in the city of New York. He holds an MA in War Studies from King's College London and a PhD in International Relations from my favorite Turkish university, the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. And he's an expert on defense procurement, global arms production networks, and security policy. Thanks, Çağlar, for being with us. And also with us is Aaron Stein. He is the director of the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Middle East program. Previously, Aaron was a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where he managed their Turkey-related research program, oversaw work on non-proliferation in the Middle East with a focus on Iran, and researched non-state actors in the Middle East with a particular focus on Kurdish groups in Syria and Iraq. He also hosts the Arms Control Wong and the Middle East Brief podcasts. And finally, we have Maxim Suchko joining us from Moscow. He's a senior fellow and associate professor at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He is also a non-resident expert at the Russian International Affairs Council and an associate research fellow at the Italian Institute of International Political Studies. And he recently joined us, MEI, as a non-resident fellow. Welcome on board, Maxim. And just a few things, reminders, this is, if you haven't realized, is a virtual meeting. I will be taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all see on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question on Twitter with hashtag MEI events or email events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. So feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I will be looking at all of your questions, and I'll do my best to factor as many as possible into the discussion. And with that, we will begin. Çağlar, I would like to start with you. You're joining us from Ankara. Defying warnings and even threats of sanctions from its NATO allies, Turkey went ahead with purchasing a Russian missile defense system. Turkey's Western allies saw it as a slap in the face because they fear Russia could have remote access to the S400 in Turkey and use a potential cyber backdoor to spy on NATO assets. So Turkey operating a Russian missile defense system could compromise not only NATO and US assets on Turkish soil, but also NATO networks in general. So that's why the US suspended Turkey's partnership in the multinational Joint Strike Fighter program, which builds the new generation F35. And that will cost Turkey a lot of money. And there are also, on top of that, there are sanctions on the pipeline. So Turkey took a big risk by purchasing these S400s. And my question to you is, why? I mean, from a military point of view, does Turkey really need the S400s?
Well, thank you. Actually, that's a really difficult question. Why did Turkey buy S400? So if you look at the issue from a military point of view, we cannot. So the thing is that Turkey still needs a high altitude air defense and ballistic missile defense system. And Turkey was trying to buy this system since 1990s. But the thing is that we cannot really say that Turkey actually needed S400, and buying S400 actually came with its problems. And those problems, actually one could argue that those problems were apparent as Turkey declared that it was negotiating to buy S400 system. I think the issue is that then the question becomes, okay, if the backlash was apparent, if the answer, or well, the US response was apparent, why did Turkey buy that weapon system? So according to the government, there are four main points why Turkey decided to buy that. The first one is, as the government argued, that Russia provided or offered better technology transfer. Because the second point is that they argued that S-400 system was superior air defense system. The third point that they said, well, Turkey urgently need to buy that system. And the fourth one is, as the government argued, the United States was unwilling to sell Patriot systems to Turkey. The problem is that when we take these justifications under critical light, we tend to see that these justifications tend to crumble. So let's take the first issue, technology transfer. At this point, so we know that the first regiment or the first system came without a technology transfer. And at this point, we really don't know whether there will be a technology transfer and which companies will be involved in. And we tend to see different declarations from each side saying that there will be a technology transfer. But at this point, there's no technology transfer.
Sorry to interrupt, but when you talk about technology transfer, what does that mean? And Aaron, please feel free to jump in as well. Go on, please. Yes.
So the thing, yeah, that's an excellent question. So the answer is we don't know because the government never told about this. We really don't know what it will involve. At some point during the negotiations, the Russian side said, well, you can build the trucks. But I don't know whether that has changed, but throughout the time, the Russian side started to say, hey, look, we're negotiating. But again, we don't know. And we really don't know. We don't know how, we cannot, so that's why we cannot really compare that offer to the American offer. So that's actually connects to the fourth point, because the Americans, the United States, they were willing to sell the Patriot system. The thing is that Turkey didn't like the technology transfer package. Again, we don't know that. I mean, the level.
That includes co-production as well, right? The whole package includes co-production.
I mean, yeah, with the Patriots, do you mean? I mean, there are a couple of companies that are already building parts for the Patriots. So, I mean, we tend to think that that's a good fit. But even if I mean, with the fourth point, even if the United States, even if we assume that United States was unwilling to sell Patriot systems, Turkey could have always gone for the European choice. So, so those 2 points under critical light, it crumbles. And the second point, superiority of the system. So the thing is that Turkey would use S400 systems as standalone system. And if you use an air defense system as a standalone system, that the system would, if the system would not acquire data from the other radar systems, then we cannot really talk about superiority there, because the capabilities of that system would decrease significantly. And the urgent need, I mean, we're still waiting for that magical activation here. So this, again, this brings us to the question of why did Turkey buy this system again? I really don't know. The only thing that we know at this point is that this decision has been taken by 2 presidents. And I think that's it. Other than that, I don't have any data to prove any explanation.
So this is speaking from a technical military point of view. Of course, the argument is this is purely a political decision, and it's maybe that was Turkey's way of telling the West that it has other options. So going to you, Aaron, Çağlar talked about 4 different reasons, and the last one that he talked about was that the US was not willing to provide a defense system to Turkey. Is that true?
No. I mean, we have to put this in the political context of which it was going on. So the Americans and the Turks have been negotiating on and off again about Patriot since, basically since Patriot made its debut in the first Gulf War. As a Turkish policy, there is a heavy emphasis on, what we would call offsets, or what's often referred to as co-production, which is that elements of the subcontracting arrangements of these, private, of these defense deals are built in Turkey. And like Çağlar said, there is elements of the current Patriot, at least one of the missiles that is built in Turkey, and it's really modeled on how Turkish aerospace in general was built, which was on sort of the 1980s F-16 deal, where Turkey builds elements of F-16 inside its own country. It's a fascinating case study. But on this one, the political context when these negotiations began for Patriot was a time when Andrew Brunson was in prison. That's A. So it was a difficult time to focus on anything else that was going on, because so much of the political bandwidth between the 2 countries were being embroiled in hostage diplomacy. I mean, to be frank about it. Second is, this issue of co-production, that becomes a thing that is handled beneath the level of the US government and at private industry. So it's not like the US can simply say, here's what we can do for you. There can certainly be pushes on behalf of, say, the Department of Defense and stuff like that, on behalf of the suppliers, but those would be worked out in a technical, talks that would follow the intention to buy. So you say, I'm going to buy your system. We're going to go then after that, talk about how to do co-production arrangements. And that's what's going on as best as we can tell. And maybe Maxim could fill in more blanks about what's happening with the Russian S400, i.e. the first regiment from the Russians was just off the shelf. That was what was going to happen with the Patriot. That, when you get the first deployment, is then you create space, a sort of a leg time on the back end of this arrangement, where the 2 sides can then work out all of the arrangements on those offsets. What can be built in Turkey? What is proprietary? What is this? What is that? Yada, yada, yada. And so that's more or less where we're at. I think the things that, I can say in this latest round, because Patriot's been with Turkey has been going back in the 1990s, is, I mean, this is really an extension of the 2007, but really acceleration in 2013 T-Loramids, approach by Turkey. And, their first decision to purchase the Chinese HQ-9, which is the Chinese S-300, and then ultimately leads to the purchase of the S400. I can think of no other reason that this went about on the Turkish side other than it was political. You know, it's not just there is a tight relationship between the two presidents. Both presidents see a strategic advantage in maintaining cordial ties for a number of reasons: Syria, Libya, economy, natural gas. You know, you can go down the list. But this was one outcome of their strong relationship. I think what caught a lot of the Americans off guard, and certainly the Europeans, I mean, I've heard this from both, is, you know, this focus on this word interoperable. There's, I think people think of like NATO air and missile defense as like your home Wi-Fi system. Like if it's plugged in really well, that everything just kind of fits together and that they all talk to each other and that, you know, just plug, boom, boom, it's like an iPhone and it all works. You know, we really don't talk to each other in air and missile defense. You know, even intra-US systems don't talk to each other all that well for a number of reasons. So the focus on the word interoperable is more a political word. I mean, yes, there is a functional thing there in that you want your aircraft and your missiles to be able to talk to each other, but it is, you don't buy Russian stuff because Russian stuff poses an acute risk to the aircraft that will form the backbone of Western air power until 2060. You know, and so it's this sort of head scratcher. Why would you do this? And that is the thing that I mean, I spend a lot of time talking about. And two is, why would you do this knowing that the risks, you know, that nobody really wants to use, by the way, you know, nobody in Washington is sitting here going, oh, goody, we want to just smash the Turks and we want to really hurt our ally. You know, there's a lot of consternation going on here about, well, we don't really want to do this. We can't believe it's gotten this far. What do we do now? And I'd say that is more or less where we're at. And I think you see it in sort of the hesitancy across the spectrum to actually impose sanctions on Turkey for this.
Aaron, you suggested that this is a political decision, and what do you say to those arguments that Erdogan is afraid of another coup and he wants to be able to shoot down F-16s, and that's the reason why he decided to purchase S-400s? I know it's a bit speculative, but I would like to hear yours.
The S-400 is a very, very good system. You know, there's this tendency to try and just compare it to the Patriot or THAAD or something like that and say, well, X is better than Y because of Z. They do different things. And the S-400 is very, very capable, has a very, very capable radar. It's a very, very good system. The Russians build very, very good missiles and very, very good radars. So you can make a technical argument about why it's important for Turkey. As Çağlar said, it's absolutely true. There's a need for long-range air and missile defense in Turkey. But I think, so I've always argued that it's an all of the above system. It's a system that does basically everything that Ankara is kind of looking for. It has some capabilities against ballistic missiles. I think that's more limited. It has some capabilities against cruise missiles. And it has very, very good capabilities against high performance aircraft. And so one outcome of that is that it can do everything it wants, including the coup-proofing mission, which I do think is a component of this and something that needs to be thought of, but not the main driver, but a driver.
Okay, well, Maxim has been very patient. I promise I'll get to you. But before that, I have a few questions from the audience for Çağlar and Aaron. Bülent Aras is asking if there's an example of co-production of the Patriots with any other country.
Yeah, Germany. I mean, it's the first. I mean, Germany, the Netherlands, absolutely.
And Çağlar, this goes to you. The question is, how centralized was the Turkish decision to purchase this S-400 from Russia? So was it all Erdogan, or the defense establishment was somehow on board?
I mean, that's a difficult question. So as far as I can see, and as far as I know, I mean, it's mostly based on Erdogan's wishes. rather than, I don't think that it incorporated the whole defense bureaucracy in there, because I think the defense bureaucracy, they were aware of the risks and they were aware possible backlash and the US response. I think this decision, I cannot say that it's because of one person, but that one person and the close associates of him.
Okay, and two more questions before we turn to Russia. Çağlar, what will be the implications of this S400 and the US decision to kick Turkey out of F35 program for Turkey's defense industry in the medium term?
I mean, so the defense industry, what we can just basically say that the companies that are being part of the F-35 program, they're going to lose money. At this point, we know that not all companies have been kicked out of the program, but I mean, they have been slowly being phased out. But in the end, they're going to lose money. They're going to, and not only the major, let's say, not only the major companies, but the companies, the small companies that benefited from the work with those companies. So in the long run, I mean, it's estimated that these companies would lose somewhere between $10 billion to $12 billion. But I mean, we cannot really say that. I mean, but the thing is that they're going to lose, well, work share and money.
But beyond the financial burden, we know that Turkey wanted to use the F-35 program to build its indigenous defense industry. How is this gonna affect Turkey on that front?
I mean, I think so. Most of the companies that took part in the F-35 program, they actually acquired necessary capabilities. They acquired technical capabilities through, I mean, during the time that they were part of the program, and still they're part of the program. So I think in those terms, they already acquired those capabilities, and being kicked out of the program, I mean, if Turkey produces its own stealth aircraft, those capabilities would not go away, but that's another problem. I mean, then we need to talk, we need to discuss whether Turkey, and when is Turkey going to build this stealth aircraft is another, I think that's another discussion, but I think the companies, they already acquired those capabilities. So by being out of the program in terms of capabilities, I don't think that they will lose it. But the most hard hit part is that the financial.
Okay. Well, Eren, we always talk about the implications of removal of Turkey from F-35 program on Turkey, but this must have an impact on the larger F-35 program, right? So implications for NATO, for the US.
Sorry, as the US and Turkey were negotiating the broader superstructure for a Patriot deal, there was the side effort, particularly led by Congress and then the executive, about studying the implications of Turkey's removal from the F-35 program. So before the decision was made, there was an acute understanding that winding down Turkey from the F-35 program would cost somewhere in the excess of $500 million and lead to delays, particularly in the delivery of certain blocks of aircraft, mostly to European suppliers. It was decided that, through this debate, that Turkey makes something like a little more than 1,000 parts, but of those 1,000 parts, only 15 are single source. It's something like that. I'm just going off the top of my head. And then within that 15 single source, there is a smaller handful that are actually particularly acute, and that would be more difficult to find a US supplier to ramp up. And so if you read a recent Government Accountability Office report that says that there are delays in the F-35 production because of this, well, that's one, because factories have shut because of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm dealing with something similar in a kitchen remodel. And two, is the certification for those specific parts, need to come online. So I've always said there are delays. The 500 million is obviously a lot of money, but not a lot of money when it's applied to the overall cost of the F-35 program. And because the US already knew that, it was already studied, and still decided to do this shows the sensitivity that the US has about the co-mating of F-35 and S-400 on a day in, day out basis, because, as it's been explained to me, we have a pretty good idea of how S-400 works and understand, the particular sensitivities about, giving stuff away to the Russians about this particular aircraft.
Well, Maxim, thanks for being very patient. So how does Russia see its growing defense partnership with Ankara, particularly given the growing tension between the two and divergence of interests in places like the Black Sea? What do you think?
Right. Thanks for having me. It's a great to be with you, although in this online format. A few things actually I wanted to touch upon as I listen to my colleagues. The first number one, you need to kind of look into very domestic context in Russia, because there was, before the decision to sell the S400 to Turkey, there was this kind of internal domestic debate on whether it's a good idea. And obviously you had a very big group of people, mainly expert community and journalists and the general public, who were very suspicious of the decision. And I would say military-wise, there were two kind of streams of this suspicion. One is that Turkey was going to deliver all the technology that the Russians were going to share it to their Americans as their NATO allies. Speaking of this kind of historical distrust and other things. And secondly, that Turkey was going to use this in Syria against Russia's own aircraft. So those were kind of the caveats on the Russian side when the decision was made. The Russian military, and specifically the Kremlin, had their own kind of counter arguments to that. The military was saying, well, three NATO countries already have S-300 in their military, Greece, Bulgaria, and Slovakia. So there is no particular issue with the sharing the the production that the Almaz Altay, this military producer of the S400, is doing. Second, what the Russians were selling to Turkey is the export version of S400. So this is not what Russia itself uses. So there's all of the super classified stuff and technology either removed or not shared. So this is the lighter version of what Russia is using. So there's a lesser kind of security concern for Moscow. And the third counter argument that the military used was that actually it's already kind of an older generation system, because Russia is already using the S500 system. So there is no issue for Russia's own security per se in this very deal. The political aspect is of course huge, and I echo the sentiments of my colleagues here, because that the deal is not purely military or purely technological. It is military technical deal, and these deals are always political, I dare to say. So you really need to think of this kind of doctrinal vision for these types of decisions with NATO partners or with American partners. So you have, I would personally think, rather overlooked view of Kremlin policy on this, in the sense that Russia does think that there is a need for de-Westernization of international relations, for a weaker US role in the world, that the number of players who seek what they call sovereignty, right, or independence from the US is increasing. And they spotted that Turkey has been pretty much since the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was no longer this ideological component between Russia and the West. There was a weaker kind of link bringing together the Americans and Turks as far as Russia was concerned. And the view in Moscow was that Turkey seeks more independent policy in the Middle East. Elsewhere, they no longer are willing to play this kind of little brother to older brother that they used to play in the Cold War. But also, the Russia thought that aligning with these kind of states that are seeking more independent foreign policy will actually robust Russia's own global status. And in case of Turkey, and this is why Russia thought it needed Turkey, including through this deal. And in case of Turkey, Russia was needed, again, as seen for Moscow, to increase this kind of sovereignty on its regional and on other and regional and international foreign policy. Interestingly enough, there is this concept of the so-called sovereignty enabler that Russia is trying to fit itself into, meaning that Russia has some stuff that can make countries that cooperate with it more independent in their policies, more sovereign, right, as the Kremlin puts it. So the sharing military technology or building one's missile program is really huge on the foreign policy kind of agenda for Moscow. And when there is a call from these countries, then Russia definitely wants to exploit this opportunity. And the call came as, again, was thought in Moscow, not that, you know, Russia kind of pushed around to force Turkey into buying this thing, but it discerned these kind of cleavages there were between Turkey and the United States. Then Turkey, as we remember, went to the Chinese to buy this, to build this system. That didn't really work out. And then the Russians jumped in with all kinds of things that I've just briefly mentioned. So for Moscow, of course, there is this element of what one Russian military put to have US high and dry in this deal. But there is also kind of a general framework that by doing these kinds of things, you really help make this kind of international system less US centric. But also there are all kinds of perks for Russia's military technological complex. So on kind of all the sides, it seems to be a win for Moscow. But then the caveats on whether Turkey may employ it against the Russian aircraft have always been there, I would say. And then definitely, as you asked, the issue of the Black Sea and other areas is just, you know, still remains kind of a historical rivalry turf between Russia and Turkey, of course.
So from what you're saying, Maxim, this is selling S400 to Turkey is part of Russia's strategic outlook. And obviously it's an important foreign policy goal. So my next question is, what happens if Turkey decides not to operationalize it? Because it had been announced that Turkey would operationalize it in April. And using the coronavirus pandemic as an excuse, I think Turkey said that it's it will delay operationalization, but the spokesperson, Erdogan's spokesperson, said no worries, we will operationalize it, but it's not going to happen now. But I think there's a debate in Ankara that Turkey is trying to mend ties with the United States, given what's been happening, the tension between Turkey and Russia, particularly in Idlib and now in Libya. Turkey might find this as an opportunity, and also given the CATSA sanctions, Erin might want to weigh on that. Given the CATSA sanctions, Turkey might be looking a way out. So what happens? What would be the Russian reaction if Turkey says, well, thank you, good doing business with you, but we're going to put it away, we're not going to operationalize it? Well,
if they bought it, then there is no problem for Russia whether they're going to operationalize it or not, right? It's Russia's, as I mentioned, Russia's goal was not in making Turkey stronger per se, as to kind of creating this sense of stability in the Turkish leadership, that they can use this to increase Turkey's more sovereign, kind of independent from U.S. status on the international and regional arenas. So I don't think there is a big problem for Russia if Turkey chooses not to operationalize it. I would also have to add to what I've said before, that Russia actually linked some of the things that it did within the S400 Turkey to other things. So you would see where, if you kind of trace back to see when these deliveries took place, Moscow wanted to emphasize it every time or link it or tie it to some kind of important initiative on Syria, for instance, right? Would say there would be a crisis and Russian military and Turkish military would not really see eye to eye, and then Putin and Erdogan, have a phone conversation, and Putin say, well, the first delivery is going in about like 2 days, trying to kind of project that there are this kind of other bigger things that you really have to be interested in if you want to stay in this relationship. And secondly, it's quite interesting that Turkish military officers that came to be trained for the operation of S400 were supposed to be doing so together with the Chinese, except for the Chinese were kind of at the third stage of their operation than the Turks would. So that's kind of to my idea on how Russia sees it kind of in a strategic context.
Well, Çağlar, going back to, I think Turkey needs to buy fighter jets, right? So if it's not going to be F-35, it has to come from somewhere else. So what are Turkey's options?
Well, yeah, Turkey needs to buy fighter planes. Currently, the plan was to buy F-35s and start to replace aging F-4s and F-16s. Now, the problem is that we don't have the F-35. Maybe we will. But the thing is that, so the options are Turkey, at this point, Turkey would try to modernize the existing F-16s. The other thing is that Turkey is now betting on its own indigenous fighter plane. That's the TFX. But the problem is that we really don't know when the TFX will be ready. Some experts say that that plane can be ready by 2030. So what's Turkey would do? Erdogan at some point said that, well, Turkey could buy fighter planes from Russia, but that's just a political brinkmanship, because buying Russian airplanes, it will come with more problems. So at this point, the only viable option seems for Turkey seems to modernize the existing planes.
Well, Eren, Çağlar just hinted that Turkey might still get F-35. So, and I think it was late last year, although Turkey has been removed from the F-35 program, a top Pentagon official did not close the door on Turkey rejoining the program in some form. Should Turkey remove the S-400s, is that possible?
I mean, the point, it wasn't transmitted very well, so if I had to sort of criticize the US, one, the first talking points about this were bad. The US focused on this word interoperable, which again raised this sort of, the iPhone should talk to your Apple TV vision in people's minds about how air and missile defense work. I think that was a political thing and not really a technical thing. And that was a bad way to handle it, because now everybody focuses on interoperable. Two is, the incremental way that the signals to Turkey were, if you do this, we may kick you out. So the first thing, and I forget which NDAA it was we'll do a study, the typical American thing, we'll do the study. Then actually the study said, okay, we can remove them. This is how much it's going to cost. And then ultimately we end up removing them. But the removal was always with the caveat, you can come back if we can reach agreement on the S400. I think what really went out the window and what really shifted the debate in Washington was not the delivery of the system, which was very showy, and the Russians did a very, very good job of packing those things on aircraft rather than sending them by sea, which would have been much more, economically prudent. Was the announcement that the Turkish soldiers had gone to Russia for training, and that was the trigger. Now we have this place where they have been delivered. They were sitting on the apron at Murted Air Force Base. I would look at them about once a week, through Planet Labs. You can get a picture of that air base, every day. But I'm not that obsessed. So every once in a while I would look at them, and they were just sitting there. We caught the radar up a few times, so clearly they had tested it. And then one day they disappeared, and it was about November. And we don't quite know where they are on the base, but they're clearly in some sort of warehouse on the base or near them, or they moved them elsewhere in the country, and I don't know about it. That seems to be in response to the Trump administration, and floated through Lindsey Graham of all people, that, for shorthand, I say, the keep it boxed compromise, we won't impose CATSA so long as you keep it boxed and you don't activate, or I say switch on. But even though CATSA hasn't been implemented, the uncertainty about the legalities of whether CATSA will eventually be implemented, and on top of that, Congress being super, super pissed off that CATSA hasn't been implemented, has held up basic military cooperation between the two countries. So now that Turkey doesn't have F-35, they're going to have to keep the F-16s flying, but they're going to need basic maintenance. A lot of those basic maintenance requires foreign military sales, just basic bread and butter of the alliance, and those are being held up. And that's where I think eventually we're going to have to either get some clarity on CATSA, or we're just going to have to move this forward. Because in the same way that the Russian rationale, which I think at some point is driven by, I want to make some defense export dollars. The S400 doesn't really pose a risk to the F-16. And so we have no real reason to have to hide the Turkish F-16s from the S400. And that seems to be a good compromise. But I could maybe, if we can get some sort of resolution on S400. I don't know what it is. I've proposed something, that Turks will think I'm insane, about some sort of inspection protocol to make sure that they stay in the warehouse. You can get Turkey as a foreign military customer of the F-35. So maybe not back in the consortium, but they can purchase it like Israel or some of the other foreign buyers. I mean, I think that's fantastical, and a lot of Turks on the call will tell me I'm an idiot, but I think that is sort of the way that I would try and frame it. But I'd love to hear other options if people have them. Okay,
I'm sorry, I keep moving my camera because of the light in the room. Okay, so it's better. I apologize for that. Maxim, is there a debate in Russia about selling Russian fighter jets to Turkey?
Well, let me. I'm going to share in chat with the participants, but then say, actually, 2 days ago, the chief of Russia's Federal Service for Military Technological Cooperation, that's kind of top government agency for defense procurements for their authorization and other things, gave an interview and said that actually Russian and Turkish military experts are now in talks over, I'm quoting him, discussing the possibility of cooperation in the production of aircraft and air defense systems. So I think there's movements on the ground, but also I have to say that, as Aaron mentioned, Russians are good at production of missiles, but they're not good at production of drones. And that actually is one area where Moscow wanted to kind of exploit this S400 deal to swap it with a Turkish technology on the production of drones. Because Russia doesn't really have a lot of options. There are some projects with the Israelis, but then of course it cannot cooperate with Europeans. I mean, it can, but a bunch of sanctions and stuff, and definitely not with the US, but it is looking for some agent or some country that are good at production of drones. And that's one area that I think where Russia thinks there might be a mutually beneficial cooperation with Turkey.
Okay, I'm looking at some of the questions from the audience, although I have several of my own.
I think Aaron had that two-finger follow-up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, because I forgot to mention it. It's something that both panelists have brought up. I think one of the reasons that that there was synergies with Russia and Turkey, and why I do think that there will continue to be talks about the Su-35, about aircraft production in Turkey, is if you don't buy American and if you don't buy European, there's really only one supplier out there. And if you are a Turkey, which sort of really is shifting its foreign policy, this is not sort of as crude as, axis shifting in east or west, but you see Turkey as, we're a regional power and we want to be treated as such, and you have to take us seriously. And we have invested billions and billions of dollars, in the excess of magnitude in Turkish lira in terms of tax revenues, in developing an indigenous defense sector. One way to make that sustainable and lucrative and to sort of truly build a sustainable is to export. But if you're using significant amount of American components, which Turkey does, you're still subject to ITAR restrictions, so secondary restrictions on who you can export them to. You're seeing this in the T-129 issue with Turkey trying to sell attack helicopters to Pakistan and I believe Singapore, if I'm remembering correctly. Russia doesn't have those types of restrictions, and so like a byproduct of making this switch, and we always make this argument. Yes, it's in the short term economically stupid to bring yourself away from a U.S. sort of centric defense, a defense relationship for your own armed forces. But if you have a different set of variables in your mind as a decision maker, like I think Erdogan does, you can make the argument that you're taking a short-term loss for a long-term gain. Now, I'm kind of trying to think like the Turkish leadership here, and obviously I'm not Turkish, but I can see why they could make the case. Like, yeah, it does make sense to try and extract from Russia as much as we can on Su-35, even though they're not getting it, because it will help us in the longer term begin to develop some sort of tacit and explicit knowledge for our own defense industry that would give us more flexibility for exports in the future, if that makes sense.
There is a question about the Black Sea from the audience. So the question is, how will this whole S400 business going to impact Turkey-Russia balance in the Black Sea? Maxim, I think that's for you, but others can weigh in.
Sure. Well, again, it's a big question for Russia. Is a country that has kind of these 4 huge strategic directions and doesn't really have any allies, and that's actually quite important. I have to say that Richard Haas, president of the Council of Foreign Relations, once actually a few years ago noted that Turkey is an ally of the United States but may not be a partner. And actually, I think it's a very interesting phrase, because for Russia, it is exactly the opposite. It is definitely not an ally, but a partner, which means Russia does not have any kind of illusions or expectations and doesn't really get very upset. Well, it does, but it doesn't really expect Turkey to do certain things when say, Erdogan goes to Kiev the next day after talking to Putin and says, Crimea is annexed and occupied by Russia and things like this. So it kind of understands this is kind of the, that's what you have to deal with. But it does look at Turkey as a partner and wants to do all these things that I've just mentioned before. So the Russia has, as I mentioned before, kind of these huge strategic directions and has to think about, defense and security, and heavily relies on its nuclear kind of posture. And now you see this kind of, as a cover up for the northern part, you see this military buildup in the Arctic. Then there are this, the Asia front, and then there's the Eastern front with Europeans that seems to be, or with NATO rather, that seems to be the most kind of vulnerable part because of the proximity of the Baltic states to the Russian border. So there has been recently, I would say, pretty much since 2015, since Russian intervention in Syria, but perhaps even before that, huge focus on the kind of making the southern underbelly, as Winston Churchill would put it, of Russia more secure. And that extends all the way from Central Asia to the Caucasus, to the Black Sea, and with extension to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So you've seen a huge military buildup. So of all in this entire Crimea operation in the spring of 2014, I mean, living beyond all the rhetorical things on it's being part of Russian stuff, which man, it was, but it doesn't really have to do with that. I think the military component is huge because the Crimean kind of bottom of the sea has this very interesting porous kind of bottoms that enable Russian nuclear submarines to hide there and be stationed there. So and traditionally Russian Black Sea Navy is not really so strong, right? It suffered many defeats, including from the Turkey, from the British and many others. But now since 2014, Russia saw an opportunity in strengthening its Black Sea posture, and kind of extended all the way down to the Eastern Mediterranean and Syria. Then there was this discussion of Russia. Now you see the extension of the Russian military bases in Syria, which are meant to control or at least project some power or leverage to one of the critical choke points in the Middle East, the Suez Canal. And you see all these kind of military adventures in Libya. that may actually end up in some kind of Russian military presence. So it actually, I think, ties all together in how Russia thinks about its military and security, because, you know, knowing that the Mediterranean is one area where the Western military is dominating, Russia thinks to at least be able to monitor all this kind of military activity there, and B, at least build some layer of defense, as what Americans would say A2AD. You know, I think there's a lot of criticism, but I personally think there is a lot of truth to that as far as Russia is concerned, in how it wants to approach potential military conflicts, or, you know, building military deterrence in that area. And
Aaron,
yeah. Mhm.
go ahead, please.
No, I'll just shut up here. I also mentioned that, you know, I think since 2015, the Black Sea has always been this one area where, and remains to be one of the primary rivalry areas between Russia and Turkey. And neither S400 deal nor, you know, Russian-Turkey cooperation or agreements on Syria have actually changed that part. So that's.
I wanted to link that to my next question to Aaron. Black Sea has indeed become, it's always been a battlefield between Turkey and Russia, but the status quo has changed with Crimea in 2014. And that is actually one area, Black Sea is one area where both the Western world and Turkey are concerned about the growing Russian influence there. Aaron, my question to you is how, maybe this is a larger question. For instance, let's assume if Turkey looks elsewhere to purchase fighter jets, how will this impact future NATO operations and also Turkey-NATO partnership in places like the Black Sea?
I mean, I just want to echo what Maxim said. I couldn't agree more. You know, it's the, you know, I think I'm stealing this term from Igor Delano, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, but you know, sort of yeah, there you go. Yeah, sorry. the calibrization of the Russian Navy, i.e., the augmenting of their surface fleet with, you know, the equivalent of the Tomahawk, you know, and I would add to that, you know, because I come from an arms control background, you know, the self-combustion of the INF. You know, you have this new situation that is emerging where the Russians have a multitude and multitudes of systems that can range Turkey. Not that they didn't have them before, but they have a lot more options now. So, you know, so the speculation that the S400 could be used against the Russians, I think, is sort of focused a little too much on just like one little system and not everything that Russia can bring to bear in that sort of case. And then I think that extends to the Black Sea, the question you were asking, Ganu, which is, you know, I would say that, you know, one bright spot within this downturn in sort of US-Turkish, and I would say Turkish-NATO relations, even though we try and wall it off, there's a lot more than just US-Turkey, has been continued cooperation on the Black Sea. Particularly Turkey's cultivation of Black Sea neighbors and cooperation with regional navies in that sense. And I would, you know, and will Turkey? I'm just not sure if Turkey will buy Su-35. My number one rule in analyzing Turkish politics is just listen to what the leadership says, and the leadership says they're talking about it, and I know the Russians say that they're talking about it, so I say, okay, they're talking about it. Whether they'll consummate this deal is something that I don't know. You know, it's something that we'll see, and I have no idea if that's true. I will say, you know, one of the major issues that people were worried about was that, you know, exercises in Turkey with the F-35, if the S-400 was active, would become very problematic. But the S-400 for now is still boxed. And so we don't have to deal with that issue yet, but it will have to come up. I will say the more pressing issue is political, and I'll stop here. And it's something that, you know, came up at NATO 70th, you know, in London, which was Turkey's blocking of consensus to pass the graduated response plan. I should say, Turkey's linking of the graduated response plan for the Baltics to the southern flank, i.e. to Turkey's defense along its border with Syria. Obviously the Greeks or the French leaked that. And I think it was and I think the main problem there is that politics about an out of area thing, Syria, US support for the YPG, had upended, consensus on something that should be easy to solve, which is, at least on paper, the basic skeleton of the plan to defend the Baltics. And that still hasn't been solved. There was reporting that, it'd been solved. Turkey just lifted the block to allow it to go to the next level. Those debates and disagreements continue. And I think that, signals poorly, and that sort of links all together between Black Sea and the Mediterranean and the interjection of outside influences. And so it really kind of makes Turkey an outlier. Really, final point is that, we tend to focus on Donald Trump and sort of the American political dysfunction playing out every single day and every single hour in front of our eyes. But if you were to go inside of Brussels in sort of NATO headquarters, the sort of determination to sort of get back to business after the Russian invasion of Crimea, the Donbass, is serious. And I would say there's more resolve to actually do something, to better plan than pre-2014. So NATO in that sense is healthier, but maybe the external political forces are preventing it from being as in tip-top shape as it should be.
Well, Aaron, you talked about the political significance of this, and I agree with you, and I'm going to pose my last question to Çağlar about that. But there's a question for you, Aaron, from the audience about the status of the nuclear weapons at İncirlik. The question is, this tension, will it lead to a stronger effort to remove them from Turkey?
Well, it needs to come with an alliance-wide consensus. Clearly, the United States can influence that. There was a story in the New York Times a couple of months ago. I can't remember. What's happening with the nuclear weapons in Turkey is that that specific bomb, it's the B-61 Mod 3 or 4, is being, we would call it upgraded or updated or renovated to becoming a B-61 Mod 12. Basically, they're taking all the B-61 models, I think there's 11 of them, and just condensing them down into just one called the B-61 Mod 12. At some point, those bombs are going to have to come out of Turkey, come back to the US, and get their upgrades. It's a guided tail kit and some new electronics. And the explosive package will be from the B-61 Mod 4, I believe. And then it will go back to Turkey. And within the negotiations about this process, Turkey had requested and updated to its liability, basically nuclear liability. What happens if this thing goes off in Turkey? Who pays for cleanup? Stuff like that. And it was in the context of those negotiations over the liability that it got leaked to the New York Times that these weapons may come out. I think the fact that it even got leaked shows that there's considerable consternation about these weapons, and it goes back to the coup attempt. Basically, when the July 2016 coup attempt happened, and the base was essentially shut down, the power was shut off at İncirlik for days on end. It was kind of a wild time for the Americans there, who don't really have much interaction with their Turkish counterparts, even though they share a base. Raised the question of, are these weapons truly secure? So I don't think they'll be removed, particularly as arms control with the Russians completely implodes. We're looking at a future of American and Russian, restraints being removed on overall numbers, largely over stupidity from our side. Well, the Russians violated the INF, but we're the ones who are going to kill New START. And so, I think those bombs will stay. But they aren't really usable. As I said, the Russians can range İncirlik very easily, and I think that's night one of a Russian strike plan on NATO, because you don't want to let nuclear air bases left go unscathed if we're really going to throw down.
Well, Maxim, there are several questions about Libya, what Russia is doing in Libya. They are backing opposing fronts in Libya. So the question is, how is that? I guess this could turn into a general question about the diverging interests of Turkey and Russia, not just in North Africa, in Syria, but in other places, in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, and all that. So the question is this an impediment to closer defense partnership between Turkey and Russia?
Yeah, Libya is actually a very interesting case. First of all, it's different from, and in many ways, from Russia's policy in Syria. And I think actually in the last few years, it really has become a mixed bag of Russian kind of state interest, Russian ambition to play a global, global power status, and a bunch of kind of corporate slash group interests. I think in actually now in its current shape, I actually refer to what used to be a notorious kind of lead from behind policy in the Obama administration years. But I think actually Russia is trying to sell this image to the Europeans now, playing its own kind of, lead from behind approach to Libya, making the Europeans think that they are actually, or putting the Europeans in the driving seat on kind of peace initiatives, but still being the one who is steering the wheel, in reality. Actually, a few things. I think ideally Russia would want to have Libya as one of the kind of policy agenda to cooperate with the Europeans, right? Because right now it's, since 2014, after the conflict in Ukraine, the relations have really pretty much boiled down to conflict in Ukraine between Russia and Brussels. But at the same time, there is this view that also Europeans are very much kind of in disarray, in the sense that they can't get their act together as a united actor, and different European member states have their different policy approach. I mean, look at just France and Italy in particular. But at the same time, it's either if you pretty much, boil it down to real politic thinking that prevails in Moscow, it's either the Russians or the Turks who get the upper hand and, all the exert ultimate control over Libya and can be an ultimate decision maker. So there was this attempt between Putin and Erdogan earlier this year in January to do a deal on Libya that would have both Russia and Turkey in a kind of comfortable position where they both can extract their own benefits and also use this case as a leverage against the Europeans. It didn't really work out because we've seen more additional, Turkish troops and then Russian mercenary forces fighting for opposing camps. My sense is that this fight will have to end in a certain stalemate that will again bring Moscow and Ankara to some kind of a deal, even though I think Haftar remains to be kind of a big problem to deal with for Russia. I don't particularly think it will affect other areas. I mean, I have to say that the parties were rather successful in trying to compartmentalize this relationship. But ultimately, and I'll end here, I see a certain bottom line, because if we think of Russia and Turkey as a marriage of convenience, and of course, it's very much, very personalized between Putin and Erdogan, not so institutionalized. But this marriage of convenience has to stay for the kids. And by the kids, I mean some of the initiatives that Putin and Erdogan have worked on together, because both came to power in early 2000s. Both they've been around for quite a long time, and they have transformed their countries and their foreign policies to a rather significant degree. So they now have these kind of kids, what I call them, as Akuyu power plant, Turkish Stream, these military deals, other kinds of things that they see mutually beneficial. And even though there are some bitter disagreements, geopolitical and historical and others, they think that, staying together for this kind of kids and actually planning for more kids, if I may continue with this metaphor, will ultimately benefit the relationship. But again, as I mentioned, I personally think of Russian-Turkey relationship as this kind of dialectics of fragility and flexibility. So they're very fragile, very emotional, and very dependent on the context. So if you say, I think in the Russian press, you would see, one day they're talking about this huge kind of strategic cooperation, and then something bad happens, and they're talking about bringing back the memories of how many wars the Russian and Ottoman empires had and things like this. So it's pretty emotional, but at the same time has to be, it until now showed some flexibility. And as I mentioned, if they're planning to stay together, if only for this kind of kids that they have now.
Well, the kids are suffering. Several problems on the nuclear Akkuyu plant and energy front and all that, but that's a topic of another panel. But my last question to you, Çağlar, and please, I know the most difficult question, but you have to be quite brief as we are running out of time. So is this is the question in everyone's mind. The fact that Turkey has purchased S400 as a NATO country and planning to cultivate closer defense ties with Russia, is this a strategic shift away for Turkey, away from the Western security structure?
Well, I can be really brief on this. Actually, no, because I think, well, just so S400 procurement could be just a fluke or a thing that Turkey tries to show the others that, hey, look, I have alternatives. And beyond that, we cannot be sure that there will be increased defense cooperation with Turkey and Russia. As a matter of fact, since, if I'm not wrong, since 1993, there is a military and technical cooperation agreement between Turkey and Russia. And there have been an on and off some agreements and purchases from Russia, but that relationship never took off. And I don't think that that relation would take off in the future, because we just need to look at the defense industrial relations. And the United States and the European countries are the how can I say, the largest partner of Turkish defense industry. Turkish companies, they are integrated into the production networks of the Western, let's say, arms production. And as this is the official policy that actually Turkey encourages its companies to take part more in collaborative works within the OPCAR framework. So if we look at the issue from that relationship, no one would like to put those relationships into the risk, connected to actually Aaron's point. I mean, if Turkey wants to make its defense industry survivable, then actually integration into the Western structure is a better way to do. So I don't think that there will be a strategic shift. And the latest events after the Idlib also shows that how Turkey values NATO partnerships and the United States. So what we can say just is that what Turkey is trying to do is to have the best of both worlds, rather than leaving one behind and turning to another one. It is problematic, but I think this is what Turkey tries to do.
Well, we'll end with that note. This has been a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it. And thank you to our panelists for joining today's discussion. And to the participants, if you also enjoyed the discussion and want more of this, don't forget to check out MEI's Frontier Europe initiative and follow us at MEI Frontier, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.